It was no problem when I went there at all, 2016 or whatever it was, 15. And I went through Choreo Tours. I recommend their website if you want to see more about North Korea. They have a lot of trips. They have one very good one now. I was almost tempted to go again, except you can't go. They're doing the mass games, which is where 250,000 people do exactly the same dances and color cards and everything. And they're doing a film festival, which would be very interesting to see. And something else is going on. So Choreo Tours, if you ever are interested and we can ever go back to North Korea, definitely check out their website because they have maps of all the small towns that you go through and different tours. You can pick any one of 8 to 10 tours that they have. And they're based in Beijing, but they're a British-run company. And they go other places too, but North Korea is their specialty. Some of you know that I just got back from almost a month in Africa, about a week ago. But I couldn't get that together in time. I knew that was going to happen, so I wanted to show this because it's very timely. As you know, probably the leaders of North Korea and South Korea are together and thinking about possible reunification, which we'll talk about here. They've been thinking about that for a long time, but there's implications to that that are very complicated for the United States. And as you know, of course, Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un are best buddies now. So we'll see what's going to happen over there. Meanwhile, I don't know why Americans can't go there. It doesn't make any sense. This would be a good time to go there. I enjoyed my trip there. I would go back. I found it a pretty country. I found the people attractive, and I can't say friendly because we really weren't allowed out to talk to the people, but they seemed nice enough. And you don't really see the terrible things that are alleged to go on there. Nor do you see them here if you're a tourist in New York or California or San Francisco. You don't see the fact that we have more people incarcerated than the other country. You don't see that. So you don't see what's going on in North Korea either. But also you're not allowed to talk to anybody, at least when I was there. So with that, and I will talk, by the way, about Ethiopia in October. So this trip I went to Ethiopia, South Africa, Cape Town, Kigali in Rwanda, and Kampala in Uganda. So talk about that some other time, but not today. So the music that I just played was, as I said, Arirang, which is something like the Korean national anthem. It's an old folk song that both North and South Korea consider their anthem. It's a beautiful song. And as I was saying, if you Google Arirang, you'll find people doing hip-hop to it and jazz versions and everything else. It's a very popular song, and it's really a very pretty song. Okay, so North Korea, we were quick to learn, is called the People's Republic of Korea, or DPRK, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or they just call it Korea, not North Korea. As I said, Choreo Tours is in Beijing. It's owned by the British, and we had an orientation in Beijing about a half a day, telling us how to dress and what to say and what not to say and what pictures to take and not to put your hands in your pockets and definitely not to pass out any religious tracts. And no books. You're not allowed to take in any books on Korea or Asia. We were there 7 days, 7 nights, I guess. And we stayed in different places every night. It was quite an exhausting tour. I don't usually take tours. I usually go on my own with a guide. But this was a good tour that Choreo Tours had. And But the trouble was it started like at 7:30 in the morning for breakfast, and we would travel all day around the country, sometimes until 9:30, then check into the hotel and then eat dinner, and then go to sleep. So I was a bit worn out. I was probably the oldest person on the tour. We went all the way down to the border with South Korea. We didn't go north of Pyongyang, so I don't know what that looks like. You could not exchange money for DPRK currency. You couldn't take it. I never saw any, actually. I saw pictures of it on the internet, but I never saw any wons. But they accepted euros and Chinese currency, yuans, and American currency. And probably the reason they tolerated visitors at all is because they're very anxious to have foreign currency. It's a poor country, and they can buy a lot of things if they have foreign currency. They can't buy anything with their currency. So we weren't allowed to take photos for the military, which I did, photos of garbage, which I didn't see, people cleaning, we saw that. I took pictures of it. Anyway, all these no-nos turned out to be unnecessary. But we did get our orientation. And you're not supposed to fold your newspaper over the picture of Kim Jong-un or any of these people. As I said, the toilet paper situation may be dire, but still you have to be very careful how you fold your toilet paper, how you fold your newspaper. So, we don't know what the violators, we know in the case of that young man who died in captivity, that some punishments were very severe. So the orientation was in Beijing, and then we flew on Koryo Airlines to Pyongyang, the capital. And we had one day there, and then we went south to these different destinations that I've outlined here. And then back to Pyongyang, and then back to Beijing. So back in 2015, the State Department was not keen for people to go to North Korea. But they talked about the risk of arrest and long-term detention, which I guess could happen. But we were very careful to follow the rules and not bring all these things that you're supposed to not bring. Otto Wambler was the young man who, in 2016, was caught stealing a poster. He was sentenced to 15 years of hard labor. This picture is of him getting his sentence. He was weeping in court. And then, of course, he was returned to his parents, dead. So now you can't visit there at all. So this was the part of my trip that I started in Berlin. I had a meeting there, and I spent about a week and went to Istanbul and then to Kazakhstan, spent a week in Astana there, which I have showed pictures of that, and then to Beijing, where I spent some time, and then to Pyongyang, and then I continued to Harbin in the north part of China. So it was a long trip. I wound up with pneumonia in a hospital. I don't do those things anymore. The population of Pyongyang is 2.5 million. It's a lot of people there. In the whole country, about 25 million people. Kim Jong-un is our supreme leader. The won is the currency that's worthless. Korean is the language, and North Korea has the 4th largest standing army in the world. It is a good way to eat if you join the army. I don't think you have a choice, but if you are a member of the armed forces, you get to eat something. They looked very skinny to me. This picture of the currency in the corner is the won, which is the closest I've ever been to the currency. Is that me?
No.
Okay, could you turn your cell phones off, by the way? So Air Koryo is the airline. And as you can see, it's quite nice. A lot of Westerners on board. This is what you get instead of a visa, and Koryo Tours takes care of all that stuff for you. We had 2 buses. we had 2 groups of 12 each. And our groups were people from the West. We didn't have any Chinese people on our tour. And we had, each bus had a guide from Koryo Tours. And then we had a male and a female guide from North Korea. And they were very nice. They spoke pretty good English, and they kept with us all the time. There were some times when I didn't get off the bus, and then I had a guide stay with me. And that turned out to be very interesting because it was a good way to find out about their lives, which they didn't tell us much about. So as I said, we toured from 9 o'clock in the morning, sometimes 7 o'clock in the morning. Stayed in 5 different hotels and different one each night. This is a woman in traditional dress in the airport, but you don't see too much of traditional dress. I have to say that the first time I heard about North Korea was from our resident here, Rosemary Straley, who I doubt will come today, but she was there very early on in a women's group, and she bought one of these dresses and she gave her narration of one of these beautiful dresses. This is some of the people in our group. Ronnie was our leader. We were Group B. This is the new Pyongyang airport, at least it was new then, had just opened. And you can see in the background there are people with other tour groups. Here's a lawyer from Buenos Aires, and here's Robert, a doctor from Southern California. Turned out to be my good friend. He was one of the older people there.
Is Ronnie an Englishman?
Ronnie is an Englishman, actually, that's right. So, this is the dynasty, if you can keep it all straight, the 3, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. So Kim Il-sung was the supreme leader of the DPRK for 46 years. He was the founder, essentially. He worked with Russia to, when the Korean peninsula was divided up, Russia got the part that's now North Korea. He died in 1994, and he is the father of the country. He takes credit for the defeat of the Japanese, leaving America's role aside. He was the guy who decided to invade South Korea and start the Korean War, and then the Soviets helped. And he developed this governing concept of juche, which we'll talk about a little later. It distinguishes them from communism. I'm not sure quite what it is, but it is unique to North Korea. He's considered the great leader. Kim Jong-il, his evil son, was the supreme leader of the DPRK from 1994 to 2011, 17 years. His tenure was marked by famine, repression, and military. Military first was his motto. The famine was not entirely his fault because at that time the Soviet Union disintegrated and the source of resources, money and food and everything else that came from there dried up. So the famine was very severe and probably 2 million people died during the famine. But he was a very repressive leader. For some reason he loved American movies and he was called the Dear Leader. So our guy, Kim Jong-un, has been, his father died rather suddenly and he took over in 2011. He doesn't seem to be as repressive as his father, nor as beloved as his grandfather. And I'm not sure he's not doing such a not bad job there. I think he's loosened things up a little bit. He's brought, this is my opinion from what I'm reading, but it's very hard to find out what's going on there. I think he's brought some money in from other countries, almost like venture capital. And I think he's given the people more recreational facilities. And I don't know really how people get their food or what they eat. There's no grocery stores that I ever saw. So somehow they get their rice distributed based on their contribution to the society. And that's all I know, which is very frustrating when you spend 10 days there and you still don't know how people eat. So he is considered the marshal, and he is, I guess, 37 now. He's married, probably has 1 or 2 children, and he loves nuclear bombs. This is not an irrational, he's not an irrational man like some presidents we know. He is very rational. And this building up of nuclear armaments certainly has put North Korea on the map, has allotted them a lot of benefits that they would not ordinarily get, and deference, and he's going to hang on to them, I would predict. And he likes basketball too, and that's why Dennis Rodman was there visiting him. You may remember that. These are some of the artworks that you see in North Korea that actually I took these in Beijing at the Koryo Tourist headquarters. They're very interesting. They're like Russian Expressionism from that era. They're very militant. Of course, karate is a Korean sport, and they do it in North Korea and South Korea. Pronounced karate. This is a painting, the perception of the West, where they perceive that we are watching them and that we have our guns turned on them. Not a completely inaccurate perception, I might add. These are the mass games, which are now going on again, but when I got there, they had stopped. And this is quite a remarkable spectacle. 250,000 people doing this synchronized dancing and gymnastics, and they have cards of different colors and they turn them at the same time, so you see a completely different picture. It would be really interesting to go there and see that again. How that happens with 250,000 people is remarkable when you think about it, and I didn't have a clue how that works, but all these people must be being trained at the same time to do this. They're ideological games. They praise the Workers' Party, and they, and of course, Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il. It's a long story, the history of Korea. It was partitioned after World War II, and Russia got, USSR got North Korea. Kim Il-sung was high up in the Communist Party in Russia, and he took credit for the defeat of Japan. He lived in the Japanese occupation, he and his family. It was a brutal occupation. They were very poor. And he was very glad to take credit for the defeat of Japan during the war. But for one reason or another, and I'm not sure what the motivation was, he decided to invade South Korea. And then Russia, USSR kicked in with help. Stalin equipped the North Korean army with modern tanks, trucks, artillery, and small arms, and also an air force was formed. And it triggered a defense of South Korea that the United Nations led, and the United States came in. So it was really became our war. It was a ceasefire declared in July of 1953. Never a peace treaty, never a peace treaty, a ceasefire. And that's been in force since 1953. And it was between the United States and the DPRK, not South Korea, between the United States and the DPRK. So technically, we're still at war 53 years later. It's very interesting. I didn't know any of this. You probably know this.
You talk about the Russians being involved.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I've got to answer questions Chinese afterwards. Do you mind? The Chinese were involved, and that's how MacArthur got fired and all that stuff, because MacArthur wanted to invade China, and Truman did not, and so MacArthur got the can. I really have to take questions afterwards because I've got too many slides, and it's a complicated business. So if we have time to answer questions, so they're very good questions, but not now probably. So this concept of Juche, which Kim Il-sung developed, which upset the Soviet Union, focused on Korean independence and discarded Marx and Lenin's teachings, causing a rift with the USSR. They didn't like this concept. It involved ostensibly independence of the people, but guided by a central strong leader, as far as I can tell what the concept is. There was a time after the Korean War when North Korea was prospering and South Korea was not. South Korea was very poor. and in the 1960s and 70s, and then the United States poured a lot of money into South Korea. Of course, it's now booming. This is Russian television. I'm not going to show the whole thing, but it's their version.
Even the language has begun to differ. But families living on opposite sides of this divide still try to preserve ties between close relatives torn apart by war. It's a painful issue that's often used as a bargaining chip in talks between Pyongyang and Seoul.
It's happening now.
Dozens of people from the south, all selected by drawing lots, came to the mountains in Kumpang region in North Korea's east coast in search of brothers and sisters, nephews, and even children they were never given the opportunity to know. After several years, in February, family members separated by war are granted just 3 days to see each other. For many, it's their last chance.
This has happened again recently.
I don't involve any of the politics or any of the religion part. We just wanted to, this is a one country and this is a one people.
On her second trip to the country in 8 years, Mrs. Lee met us in Kaesong, the next stop after our trip to the border.
First trip was very sad. It was really dark, no lights. You know, during the meal time, lights go off like 5-6 times. And there are no smiles from people's face. But now I think it's economically changing, but I think some kind of life is coming back.
I'm going to stop that there. She's talking about this first and second reunion that they had with the two Koreas, where people from South Korea came north. And apparently that was pretty dismal and dark, and even though we had power outages while we were there, not as much as they had had back then. I'm not sure what the dates were of these reunions, but they're doing the reunions again. You probably read about it. And the Koreans think of themselves as one people with two very different forms of government. So when they talk about reunification, the North Koreans talk about using their system of government and the South Koreans talk about using theirs. Now whether reunification can happen under those circumstances is pretty doubtful. So here's Miss Jo, our guide on Group B, the female guide. She did most of the talking, and she was very nice, very pretty, and not very revealing, I must say.
So the public race, the official race, that's DPRK, so Democratic People's Republic of Korea. So that was founded on December the 8th, December the 9th, 1948. And our country was, the main party here is the Greatest Party of Korea. Okay.
You could barely understand her, right? I was sitting on probably row 13 of the bus. I could understand maybe every fifth word. So what she was saying is that it's called DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic, was started in 1948. But between the noise of the bus and her accent, which her English was very good, but I couldn't understand most of what she was saying. Every once in a while we stopped for something. And it wasn't until about day 5 that I figured out she was talking about tea houses, and what she was really talking about is bathroom stops, which weren't always very glamorous because they were often holes in the ground. She knew I like Western toilets, so she would probably make an effort to find me a Western toilet. So this is the Juche Tower in Pyongyang, and it was adopted into a set of principles the North Korean government has used to justify its policy decisions. That is the strong leader thing, which justified the repression. Popular masses are placed in the center of everything, and the absolutist supreme leader is the center of the masses. So that, in a nutshell, is Juche. So they have a different calendar. They have a Juche calendar, and the years after 1911 are described as Juche years. So the Gregorian year 2015, for example, is Juche 104. That is 104 years after the founding of North Korea in 2011. You'll see the Juche years on different things. So this was in 2013, almost 1 million active reserve and paramilitary personnel were around, the 4th largest military organization on the planet, which represents about 40% of the population and is the numeric equivalent of the entire population between 20 and 45 years old, which may be that every able-bodied person between 20 and 45 is in the military. That is not necessarily that they do military things. They do, and they're always having parades and that kind of thing, and they're equipped to do military things. But they also do building and build roads and harvest crops and do things like that. Actually, everybody in North Korea gets a week off, mandatory, 2 weeks actually, when they plant the crops and when they harvest the crops. Everybody has to be there to do that work. So in 1998, the highest priority was given to Sogun era, which is priority to the military, and that was Kim Jong-il. It's been the way the Father, Son, and let's call them the Holy Ghost are treated now is akin to religious worship, essentially. Their pictures are all over, their statues are all over, their birthdays are celebrated. So people talk about that as the religion of North Korea. And when there's always this showdown between North Korea and South Korea, and there was one a few years ago, and Kim Jong-un said it was North Korea's military muscle, not negotiation, that avoided war. He puts a lot of stock into the military, and I think he's probably right. Somebody going off there. So these are statues, and these leaders are essentially deified. And one defector wrote, "To my childish eyes and to those of all my friends, Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il were perfect beings, untarnished by any base human function. I was convinced, as we all were, that neither of them urinated or defecated. Who can imagine such things of gods?" In 1994 to 1998 was the famine under Kim Jong-il, and a very repressive government, according to Human Rights Watch reports. There were 200,000 political prisoners, no freedom of the press or religion, no political opposition or equal education for everybody. So virtually every aspect of political, social, and economic life is controlled by the government. As you read accounts of defectors, it's very important to note when they defected, because many of them defected during the famine. And of course things were horrible then. People actually dead bodies on the streets in their villages, which many people in Pyongyang didn't even know that was going on in the villages. Since then, people are still defecting, but for probably a little bit different reasons. I don't think people are starving, but nobody really knows what's going on there. For some reason, the North Koreans abducted Japanese people. It's very mysterious to me. I don't know why. Some of them have been repatriated, and some of them have not. There's a book, a fictional book about, I can't remember what it's called, I read it, about the abduction of Japanese people. It was brutal, and unless they were being trained to be spies, it didn't quite make sense. On the top, you can see some very brutal pictures and depictions of how people were treated in the jails in North Korea. Pregnant women were kicked in the stomach, children were killed. Many people died of starvation, sicknesses, accidents, or torture. But there's no information on this that's accurate. So one of the books by defectors is called The Tailless Animals, Prison Memoirs of a North Korean Woman, about her times in the camps. So those kind of accounts are available, but there's no official documentation of who's in prison, why they're in prison, how long they're in prison, how many people die in prison. So when you hear about horrible tales from North Korea, some of those are fabricated because there's really very little official information. After the famine, people started trading food with each other. And you'll see in the countryside that every cultivatable inch is planted with food. And on their own property, people can keep their food, and I guess they trade with each other. I didn't see these open-air markets, but they are around. And they are able to trade and sell their extra produce. When the police tried to shut the markets down, there were riots, so they don't try to shut them down anymore. And some stuff was coming in from China, their old clothes, their old electronic stuff, and also being smuggled in from South Korea. So it's not as airproof as it used to be. A lot of things are coming into North Korea from the other neighboring countries, including Japan. So people know a little bit more about what's going on there now. The Japanese occupation, just to say it was brutal is enough. It was a horrible occupation. And people were very poor in Korea at that time. They made out that the Japanese and the Koreans were unified, but that is really not true. So Kim Il-sung's family resented the Japanese occupation, and that began in 1910. 52,000 North Koreans were arrested in 1912 alone, and many Koreans settled in Manchuria, which wasn't much better. Kim Il-sung was not a Korean. He was a Russian. His Korean was marginal. He practically didn't speak the language. He had only 8 years of formal education, all of which was in Chinese. But he declared himself the leader, became the leader, and is definitely the beloved leader. So this is Pyongyang. If this surprises you, it surprised me. It's a very sophisticated city. It's very clean. These skyscraper apartments are given to people who help the state, especially physicists, scientists, teachers to some extent. But this is not necessarily how most people live. It's very rare for people to come from other places to Pyongyang. I think you have to have a permit to do that. So many people who live in Korea don't have any idea of what Pyongyang looks like. Nor have they been out of their home village. This is the North Korean version of the Arch of Triumph, identical practically in every detail except it's 33 feet taller than the one in Paris. And it commemorates the Korean resistance to the occupation of Japan by Kim Il-sung. It's really quite a magnificent structure. And these are our guys taking pictures in the middle of the street because there's no traffic. At least 3 years ago, there was virtually, well, there were some cars, but very little cars, which is a blessing, of course. Nice to have no traffic. And I don't know whether that's changed or not, but can't argue with that, just having come from Africa where the streets are blocked with cars. Nice to see no cars. This is a map of Pyongyang. The river runs through it, the purple part. And you can't, I did bring my pointer, but I don't have it. But the big hotel on the river is where we were housed, which you'll see. And we got a lot of newspapers, free newspapers, and one of the articles was that they were ratcheting up their anti-US campaign, so that was probably happening on television, on the radio. It didn't affect us necessarily. Always Kim Jong-un is pictures on the front page of the paper. His life is rather secretive. Apparently he was schooled in Switzerland and was a shy guy and a good student, majored in physics when he came back to North Korea. Married. His wife is fairly conspicuous, very pretty woman. And they have 1 or 2 kids. Dennis Rodman said they have 2 kids. And that he drinks a lot, according to Dennis Rodman. So, well, this is the starting of the nuclear program that he has. And it's a very powerful program. In 2013, he threatened the United States with a preemptive nuclear attack. And of course, that threat is still going on because even though Trump went there and they loved each other and it was all very sweet, there's really no steps toward denuclearification going on there in North Korea. They're very smart people. They don't want to give up their Trump card, as it were. And they are probably not give up their nuclear weapons until we take all of our troops out of South Korea and maybe a few other things happen, like unification on their terms. But I would not expect them to give up their nuclear program at all. For some reason, there are very beautiful parasols there. It was pretty hot when we were there. And the women carry these, as they do in Japan. Asian women don't like to have their skin darkened, so. And you can see the women are attractive, well-dressed. They walk a lot, so they're very slender. In the different villages, this is in the village, we saw these concert halls, which were very impressive, and for some reason, we never got into one. I don't know why. So, as I said, Kim Jong-un has renovated a lot of leisure activities for the people and built more skyscrapers. And the new airport terminal is his doing. An underground shopping center is going to happen because now people in Pyongyang have money. This is from The Economist in 2015. Housing is free, and the location and size depends on your contribution to the state. So here's some not too glamorous apartments. So there's a lot of people waiting for the bus, but you can see a lot of people waiting for the bus in San Diego too. The buses didn't seem very frequent. People seem to walk a lot. This is some fancy department store. I have no idea what this is. And these are really very nice apartments for people who deserve them. She is conducting traffic, and you can see that there is some. It's a very cherished job she has. There's the traffic, sort of usual traffic in Pyongyang. Streets are clean, well landscaped, no pollution that I could tell. There are several sports stadiums. I don't think this is the one that's the largest in the world, where the mass games go on. Their pictures and statues are everywhere. But you can see living downtown in Pyongyang is not such a bad thing. They have replicas of Chinese architecture. This is buying bouquets of flowers before our visit to the father and the son. And that's Miss Jo telling us what to buy. And this is where they are. And both sides are sculptures of the Second World War, the defeat of Japan, and also the Korean War. In both cases, they were victorious, of course. By the way, this is just incidental, but when I was in Botswana, they have a whole sort of city block dedicated to statues of their founders, who are actually very illustrious people. Big statues. And I asked my guide who made these statues, and they said they come from North Korea. So I guess one of the things they do very well is the statue business. Miss Jo. While we were there visiting the father and the son, these kids were carrying these bottles. We couldn't figure out what was going on. water. They went to get water from this very beautiful pond here. Here they are filling up their bottles, carrying them. I have to say the kids looked well fed, bright, alert. I don't know what was in their heads, but then I don't know what's in kids' heads anyway. So what they're doing is watering the grass with this water that they got from the pond. I don't quite get that. This was Saturday night, about 6 o'clock at night. So here's some of the sculpture, either of the Korean War or the Second World War. You can see that artistically, I mean, it's pretty good. This is me putting flowers on the foot of the statues. This is our Group B. Very interesting people here. And there's the father and son in the back. That's a picture that, of course, is mandatory. You have to take that. My two buddies were Robert on my right shoulder, who's a doctor in Northern California, and next to him is Ravi, an Indian guy who, very wealthy guy, lives in New York, I guess. Both of them very funny and older than the rest. So Juche and Kim Il-sung was made the eternal president in 1994. There's some question about whether Kim Jong-il was the successor that his father wanted, and that's debatable. I don't know. Kim Jong-il had a sister who was North Korea's first female four-star general and married to the second most powerful person in North Korea before his December 2013 execution for corruption. So I don't know what happened there. Kim Jong-il had 4 partners and at least 5 children with 3 of them. And Kim Jong-un succeeded him, and it's not clear that he was the chosen person. A scholar wrote that the Kim dynasty represented one of the last bastions of totalitarianism, as well as perhaps the first communist dynasty, and I don't think it's quite fair to call North Korea a communist state. But all is not lost. They had very nice popsicles there. It's important to know these things. I never found any good ice cream, for example, in Ethiopia. Anyway, so this is 7 o'clock at night on Saturday night, and the military is walking through. I don't know what they're doing. But meanwhile, people are sweeping up. And they actually have real watering machines for the grass, so I don't know what those kids were doing. And here they are again. So you can see inside some of these very luxurious apartments. Some Chinese replica. This is sort of a more normal neighborhood. This is a crowd on the bus. Again, I don't know that you can conclude anything from that. This is the hotel where we stayed twice, I think, in Pyongyang. Obviously, very luxurious. A lot of women in the lobby had traditional dress on. There were so many of these examples of very luxury accommodations and other things. Apparently they were expecting a lot of visitors who could not help but be impressed with some of this. This is a evening picture from my hotel window of the city. This is a store downstairs that they have. Ginseng that they have. The cafeteria, the restaurant they have. They're always playing inspirational music. This was pretty early in the morning, so there wasn't anybody there. A very attractive waitress. And that was me. This is what we got for breakfast almost always. An omelet, which was pretty good, white toast, thick white bread. I don't know who else ate that except the tourists, but we had it, and jam. We were very well fed, I have to say. Here's Miss Jo again. This is the world's largest stadium, probably where the mass games go on. Holds 150,000 people. So now it's Monday morning. People are off to work on their bikes and by foot, and to some extent by bus. It's not a pleasant place to walk. There's walls there, rather monotonous, but people walk and walk and walk, even in high heels. There's a few manifestations of religious freedom there, which there isn't any really, but this is an Orthodox church, which I think is just scenery. There's the trolley and people on their bikes. Mr. Lee was our mail guide, and when I had a chance to stay in the bus, I talked to him. And things were not too well with him and his family. He had a 25-year-old son who had finished going to school to be a music teacher and couldn't find a job, so he was sort of at home doing nothing. Mr. Lee himself was diabetic, was not getting good medical care, but still had to work. And he had a long walk to where he had to go to work. It was not good for Mr. Lee. Miss Jo was telling me that her parents were, she said, doctors. So one was a dentist, one was an acupuncturist, if I remember. And I think they were doing pretty well. But I didn't find out too much about her. The usual Kim Jong-il, who was reputed to love children. People actually on the lawns trimming the grass with nail scissors. Truly, this was an occupation. So we got out of the city, and the fields were very well cultivated, even though the only heavy machinery we saw was in a garage. You'll see it. Most of the fields seemed to be plowed by oxen and by hand, but very well cultivated, growing vegetables and rice and fruit trees. It's a hilly terrain, quite green. They get plenty of rain, surrounded really by two oceans, so it's a pretty country, I thought. You can see how hilly it is. So every once in a while we stopped at a Buddhist thing. This was supposed to be a Buddhist temple. And she was our guide, dressed in traditional Korean clothes with one of these beautiful parasols. And that is really an amazingly good replica of what you would see a Buddhist temple in Japan or China. And inside were these beautiful Buddhist paintings. And very nice statues outside. It looks like the horses in Xi'an, yeah. This is our people, and this presumably is a Buddhist priest. Our guide whispered to us that he's not a Buddhist priest. This is just a show temple. So, I don't know. So this is an example. This site was registered as a World Cultural Heritage Center, Juche 93. So 93 years after the founding of Juche, which is actually 2004. So here's an example of a guy biking in the middle of the fields. Corn is growing. We got a couple of ears of corn. They weren't very good. It felt like they were not for human consumption, maybe for animals, I don't know. I don't know, maybe they weren't ripe yet. But here they are, father and son. This is a book written by a defector. No, she wasn't a defector. She was the one who snuck in and pretended to be a North Korean and taught there for a while. No, this is the one written by a man who had a very high position in the government. And he defected after he went back to his native village and found out that people were actually starving, and he was in charge of the propaganda that went to South Korea. And he couldn't do it anymore, so he defected successfully. He went to China. He talks all about it in his book. It was very difficult because it was very hard to go to China. They did not want North Koreans there. And he says that Kim Jong-il plotted to become his father's successor, that's not the person his father had chosen, and that he undermined his father at every opportunity. And he talked too about Kim Jong-il, who was ruthless in getting the job and administering it. So a lot of backstories there that you don't hear ordinarily. This is a little snake wine that they have, and the bigger the snake, the more expensive the wine. The more toxic the snake, the more expensive the wine. And no, I didn't try it. They had these stores every once in a while where we stopped to go to the bathroom, and they sold stuff there. Again, the effort to get foreign currency was huge. But meanwhile, there's these beautiful, beautiful mountain scenes. It's a really very pretty country. Here's a guy painting a fruit stand, and but they were selling fresh peaches, which were about the size of a tennis ball. They were pretty good. They were 1 yuan, which practically nothing. But otherwise, we didn't see fresh fruit at all. He was very friendly. This is one of our tea shops. Yeah, and Miss Jo would say, "We're stopping for Tisha." And it wasn't, until 5 days later that I figured out she was saying tea shops. And this one, she brought me especially to this Western toilet that was on the 2nd floor. What this building is for, I have no idea. We did see some military people having tea there. Typical scene, rice paddy. Typical houses that you see in the countryside. We went into one you'll see later. Irrigation ditches, which are very effective, I guess. This is, I think, the house we were welcomed into. You can see how well it cultivated is. Everywhere you see, something is growing. Here's this little village where the flowers were planted. And the usual pictures. A little store in one of the villages where people could pick up stuff for their children, toys and boots and clothes. And little dressy outfits for their girls. There's the heavy machinery. I never saw it in the fields. This is supposed to be a co-op, so farmers could use this when they needed to. I saw oxen, but I never saw anything like tractors or whatever these things are. This is the house that we were welcomed into. You can see corn growing in their yard. And in the front, and I guess they got to keep all this corn. This is their side yard planted. That might have been dinner for the month. This is the inside. This is the model house. So you can see it's not very elegant. I think 5 people live there. I'm not sure. No way to know, really. Some family pictures. Some obligatory pictures. Storage space. Of course, the house was very clean, and I would not imagine it was easy to keep these places clean because a lot of people lived in them. And they stored everything in the closets. This was the lady of the house showing her sort of sunken kitchen. She was very proud of it, she seemed to be. This is where people slept. And again, I'm not sure how many people. So that was the model house. And this is what was much more typical to see in the fields is the oxen. As I said, I never saw any machinery. This is people picking the crops. This was not harvest time, so for harvest time, I think everybody would be in the fields picking the crops, but that's what these people were doing. And this is a typical village where rich people had the motor scooters, and everybody else had bikes and were walking. gals were there, carrying firewood, rice paddies. She had quite a load on her bike. Oxen were very helpful. So there's people, this is the people we saw. We don't know who was bedridden, we don't know who was allowed out, not allowed out, but these are what people look like to us. These were darker than usual, women darker than usual because they didn't have parasols and they didn't have hats, and they were probably farm workers. Picking rice. The military being transported, found us very interesting to watch. And here's oxen again carrying, I guess, produce from town, village to village. Somebody, a rich person with a motorcycle. So we learned something about mandatory military services, either for 3 years or 10 years or somewhere in between. And mostly the military is used for building, planting, and infrastructure repair. The military doesn't look that well fed actually either, but we did know that if you were in the military, you got fed. This is the terrain. This is what it looks like on the bus. It's just more of the same, but nice enough to watch from the bus. And of course, this is, I think, the Japan Sea, or what their name is for it, I'm not sure. Little islands there, very pretty view. And this is where we stayed that night. The shoreline is beautiful. They could have quite a resort trade there, except this is all barbed wire so people don't get out. Not necessarily that people don't get in, obviously. This is hotels and apartment houses here in this little resort area. This is where we stayed. And it was fine. It was, we had our luggage. We had to walk up to a flight to get to our rooms. And it was at night that we got there, about 9 o'clock at night. So it was not easy. The room was okay. And the next day we got to visit this fertilizer plant, which apparently was a big treat. 5,000 people work here 24/7. Whether it's a fertilizer plant or a nuclear energy plant or whatever, I have no way of telling. But we got a tour, and he was a chemist that showed us all kinds of intricacies about how the fertilizer was made. This is group A, not my group, but we were all being shown around. I found it very pretty. I liked seeing all the colors, but I had no idea what was going on. So after the fertilizer plant, we went to another Buddhist building and got another traditional lady touring our building. This was the ceiling of this building. Absolutely wonderful work. You couldn't find any better work in Japan or China. Beautiful. Here she is. There I am. So these are women that you see in the countryside. Again, they're much darker skinned than the women in Pyongyang, because I'm sure they do sort of hard labor in the fields. But they were well dressed and seemed happy, whatever that means. It's very hot out, and these soldiers were wearing these very heavy uniforms and marching. Inspirational music. That's the kind of marching you see in their parades. Goose stepping. There's our guys in shorts. They must have been sweltering under those uniforms, I can only imagine. And We found out later that it was okay to take pictures of them because they weren't really the military. They were only like Boy Scouts or something. It was sort of after the fact. There's people in a traditional village. That's Mr. Lee, our male guide. You can see how hot he is. You can see the babies are carried on the back of the bikes. Traditional painting. This is a village where the women did have parasols, and they are so beautiful, these parasols. And you can see the women are wearing high heels, short skirts. You wouldn't see this in San Diego. They'd be wearing jeans and shorts and cutoffs and whatever. Another palace of culture which we didn't see the inside of. This is one of the many foreign currency book and stamp stores where you can buy this little book in English with Korean folk tales in it. All of these books are in English. You can, there's the Juche 10104, which is the equivalent of 2015. And you can see the Supreme Leader inspecting the fishery stations. And there are magazines that talk about the wonders of North Korea and wonderful praise for Kim Son, whatever his name is. This is an amazing international camp. And by international, I think they said they take children from Africa and countries that are either non-aligned or aligned with Russia. It's spotless, but we didn't see children in shorts running into the lake or anything like that. We saw sort of well-disciplined children. This is the map of the place. I am not a great walker, so I didn't go out. I just walked around a little bit. But there they are, the children. They don't seem to be doing what children in camp do. I don't know. Statues. I went into that building to go find the bathroom. It looked like all classrooms. I don't understand what kind of camp it is, but these are kids at the camp. Hardly wearing cutoffs or shorts or anything like that. Again, they look very healthy, well fed. It's a beautiful piece of land here. Their cafeteria where the kids actually cook in the kitchen and serve. Another beautiful spot. This is Ravi. He's a funny guy. Anyway, so Korean cuisine, as you probably know, you've eaten it, based on rice, vegetables, and meats. Traditional Korean meals are noted for the number of side dishes. You get a lot of side dishes. They accompany steam-cooked short-grain rice. Kimchi is almost always served at every meal. We had it, I would say, 3 times a day. And commonly used ingredients include sesame oil, soy sauce, salt, ginger, garlic, pepper flakes, and chili paste. Here's something that we ate in a restaurant. It was quite good. Especially if you like kimchi, which I sort of do. That looks sweet, it's not sweet. This is an amazing ski resort. I don't understand who they were expecting, but there wasn't anybody in there then. There is a growing middle class, and again, thanks to the famine, the population was able to rely on black market and free enterprise to make some money. And foreign currency and foreign goods came from China and Japan, apparently even Egypt. So there were public-private partnerships, which these apartment and hotels and public buildings were built with public-private money, with the military as labor, of course. So these people are called danju, who are wealthy traders whose investments have been fueling a retail and construction boom boom in Pyongyang and a few other cities. Looking at the ski resort, I assume that they anticipate lots of Dongju people, not just from Korea. This is the interior. This is our guys using the cell phone, which they've not been able to use all this time. Beautiful, and a bar and everything. We didn't stay there, but anyway, so we're back to Pyongyang, and here it is again. Happened to be the day of Kim Jong-il's death, so there were people coming from the countryside, from places that looked like they were uninhabited, all dressed up to celebrate this day. We were at his father's home. The parents, of course, and Kim Jong-il were there during the Japanese occupation. And this is where they lived, apparently. And kimchi pots, you see. So, Kim Jong-il hated the Japanese. Many people did hate the Japanese. And, of course, took credit for the Japanese defeat. So here's the subway. This is fun. Very fancy. Very steep, like the Russian subways. That was the inspirational music. But you can see the people coming up look normal, they look well dressed, they look okay. There's the trains. There's the stations that it stops in, so it has a number of stops. There's my friends. Look like they belong there. Beautiful mosaics, murals there, beautiful. There's Mr. Lee, our male guide. It's an amazing subway.
What is it in New York?
So, workers' paradise there. More inspirational music. There I am with Robbie and Robert. Kids who looked fine. Fearless leaders. Newspapers up. Of course, the newspapers are all state-controlled, but you can read while you're waiting for the subway. This is at the end of the place. Celebrating May Day, I think. Kids riding on the mother's back. They have art schools and art villages for people who do this kind of mosaics and other